and welcome back to my four-part series covering the book The Organism by Goldstein. Again, I'm Shay Stevens, and today is part 4. We're going to be talking about chapters 9 and 11. We've not gone through every single chapter of the book, but we've covered some good ground and are covering the really major ideas and progression of ideas in this book. So these last two chapters that we're going to be talking about today, the nature of biological knowledge, and the last one we'll be talking about, not the last final chapter in the book, but one of the last ones, is chapter 11 on life and mind, the problem of organismic hierarchy. And these two chapters do tie in together a bit. Chapter 11 does continue to talk about biological knowledge and kind of the nature of knowledge, what we can know about the world through the lens of biology. What is the lens of biology? These are still his considerations in chapter 11. So they do kind of tie in together. And as predicted, these chapters are some of the most philosophical of this book. This whole book is philosophical, I would say, but especially chapter 11. There's discussion with other thinkers, and just really it goes very deep, and I cannot cover all of that ground in this video. I'm going to be kind of rapidly going through these chapters for others to go and read for themselves, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the content of these chapters and some of the most important ideas that are discussed. Okay, so one of the many quotes from Goethe in this book is this first one. All disputes of antiquity and modern times up to the most recent time are caused by the division of that which in its nature God has produced as one whole. So I'm just going to check. Okay. By determining the organism's constants, we have come much closer to the essential characteristics of an organism. So in our previous videos, Kurt Goldstein is discussing this term of constants, so kind of like typical patterns of behavior that are observed in an organism, he calls constants. And he says that tells us about the nature of an individual organism or a species. Okay, and so he says, by determining the constants, we have come much closer to the essential characteristics of an organism than we would have by any resort to the phenomena that have been revealed through reflex investigations. So that's been the topic of earlier videos I made on this work. He talks a lot about reflexes and how others wanted to kind of build this atomistic understanding of humans through looking at their parts, through looking at individual reflexes, as if we can kind of calculate 1 + 1 = 2 to build up our understanding. He says we need to see the organism as a whole. That's a very overarching theme of this book. Okay, so then this last bullet point, he says, we must not forget that the criterion of preferred behavior, that is, the constants, is a more or less preliminary one, and that it cannot furnish us an indication of the actual cause for the direction of the organismic course of events in actual living. So I think this is an important quote that just acknowledges that all of the things he's saying, he says we're still just approximating the truth. We can't get to 100% accuracy of why an organism does what it does, the actual cause of the events of actual living of an organism, noticing what seems to be preferred behavior or the pattern of an organism. It's what we observe, and it gives us valuable information, but it has its limits as well. So in the quotes that I'm about to read, I really notice common themes just about what is science, what does science tell us, that this chapter really shares with Max Wertheimer's 1924 address on Gestalt theory to the Berlin Kant Society. And so he says, we deny the possibility of gaining biological knowledge on the sole basis of the phenomena that could be determined by analytic methods. Basically, that the possibility does not exist to gain biological knowledge, the topic of this chapter, solely by breaking things down, by being atomistic in our approach. He says, in saying this, we do not underrate the significance of these phenomena and things like reflexes, and they can give us information, but that does not give us, as he says, undistorted manifestations of the nature of the organism. We have to pay attention to a holistic understanding of the organism to have biological knowledge. He says, the last bullet, in this history of science, many facts have been proved to be meaningless for the progress of our knowledge. Which phenomena are biologically relevant and which are not? Which phenomena are biological facts and which are not? The criterion of that relevancy can be offered only by a conception of the organism and its qualitative organization and holistic functioning. And that's a phrase that he uses in this chapter, is qualitative organization. So it's this kind of idea of contrasting like stackable quantities versus the quality of the whole, the organization of the whole organism. He says, as Max Wertheimer says, that it's not just about facts that are stacked on facts on facts on facts gives us truth. He says some facts are more, get to the heart of knowledge, of the reality of the thing, gives us valuable knowledge. Some facts might be true, but they are more or less meaningless compared to other facts. So which ones are relevant? That's what this quote is saying. And this also is very much related to Max Wertheimer's essay called On Truth, which I'll also mention on a later slide in this video. He says, after all, what is the character of the picture of the organism we are seeking? It is not by a mere addition of brick to brick that we try to construct this building, but it is rather the actual gestalt of the intrinsic architecture of this building that we try to discover, a gestalt from which the phenomena, which were formerly equivocal, would not become intelligible as belonging to a unitary, ordered, relatively constant formation of a specific structure. So the word structure there is important. We are seeking a whole in which one can differentiate among the observed phenomena between the members that really belong to it and the less relevant contingent connections of arbitrary parts. I'll also highlight this in a later slide in this video, but it's important vocabulary there. Max Wertheimer, an important predecessor of Goldstein, he distinguished between pieces, which are these kind of separated, some of its parts kind of pieces, versus parts, and which are parts of a whole, parts considered within a whole. Those two words can kind of be translated here, except Goldstein uses members to refer to parts of a whole that are seen within the whole, and he uses parts to be the way that Max Wertheimer used the word pieces. So it's kind of confusing if you're familiar with both thinkers. It's the same concept, they switch their words around a bit to discuss these ideas. Okay, so he's talking about biological knowledge. He says, the attainment of biological knowledge we are seeking is essentially akin to this phenomenon, to the capacity of the organism to become adequate to its environmental conditions. This is a fundamental biological process by virtue of which the actualization of organisms is made possible. Whenever we speak of the nature of the idea, picture, or conception of the organism, we have in mind these essentials for the realization of adequacy between the organism and its environment. So I'm going to pause right there. This is a really big quote. I've underlined what I just read. So this is reinforcing to us the fact that when he talks about nature of an organism, he's going to say this later in this video, but he's not talking about a metaphysical nature or a soul. He's just talking about what are the constants, the essentials that allows the organism to have this level of adequacy, where its environment is conducive to what it needs. Where is the organism able to actualize? What does that tell us about its nature? It's stuff that I've talked about in previous videos in this series, but that just kind of is a good quote that encapsulates what he really means by the nature of a thing. And this will also be discussed in later slides on this slideshow. Okay, and so to continue with this quote, he says, "And these are the principles of composition of that picture that biology has to grasp. In doing so, the cognitive process of the biologist is subject to practically the same difficulties of procedure as the organism in learning. The biologist has to find adequacy, except his kind of adequacy is between concept and reality." So I know it's not exactly clear what he's saying here. What he's saying is to attain biological knowledge, for the biologist, the kind of knowledge that we are seeking, we're really seeking an adequacy between concepts and reality. Our concepts need to be adequate to describe and to predict the reality that we see. So he says, "The question is not what can we learn from the reflex for the performances of the organism. The question must rather be stated as, what does the reflex mean viewed from the whole, viewed from the performances of the whole organism? There is a fundamental difference between these two questions. The second presupposes the knowledge of the performances of the organism as necessary in order to understand the reflex." So it's this, this tendency, this principle that he has said time and time again is what his approach is all about, that of moving from the whole to understand the parts, not that we can build an understanding of parts and then that leads us to the understanding of the whole organism. He says, "Reflexological investigations have disclosed many facts of importance, but in doing so they have never offered an explanation that justifies us to proceed directly from the reflexes to the performances of the organism." In the next part of the chapter, he discusses the symbolic character of knowledge, the importance of symbol. He says, "Hertz considers the urgent and most important task of natural science to be that of enabling us to predict future experiences." And I think this is something that scientists nowadays say, especially in physics. We hear about this idea that we can use symbols that enable us to make predictions accurately, that we can use equations and concepts without being philosophers necessarily about, is this real? Is an electron real in a realist sense versus using a concept, a symbol, an image of a thing in a way that enables us to make predictions and to speak accurately of reality that we observe. I'll continue to read the quote. He says, "However, the method that natural science uses for deducing the future from the past consists in making fictitious images or symbols." Continues, "In biology, unlike in physics, we cannot be satisfied with symbols that correspond only to part processes. Our knowledge must come closer to the real than is requisite for a science of inorganic nature. The symbol must have a character of a gestalt." So he says the symbols that we use to discuss reality, in order to be adequate, those symbols must portray the whole, and the nature of a whole of a thing, not just a mere kind of piecemeal understanding of a thing that we're trying to understand, such as a human. So again, here on this slide, he says things that I think are really strong parallels with Max Wertheimer's Berlin address in 1924 on Gestalt theory, and also Wertheimer's paper on truth, which was actually published the same year as The Organism originally was, in German. He says, "Biological knowledge is not advanced by simply adding more and more individual facts," as I mentioned a few minutes ago. This single new fact may perhaps revolutionize the entire conception on the basis of former findings and demand an entirely new idea, in the light of which the old facts may have to be evaluated in a radically different way. And so there are parts of this chapter where he refuses to partake in kind of metaphysical perspectives that can very much relate to the topic of an essence of a thing, a nature of a thing, the difference between humans and animals. That's a big topic that will be discussed later in this video. And so Goldstein has this interesting nuance that I really appreciate, where he says, we're not here to really get into metaphysical questions. We don't need to do that. That's kind of his main argument, is I don't think we need that in order to say what we need to say, in order to predict what we need to predict, in order to talk about the thing with adequacy. We don't need to assert the existence of some additional thing like the vitalists do. We don't need to get into questions of a metaphysical essence. So that's what he'll say, and I'll talk about that later in this video. Okay, so he says, in this first quote, what I've inserted in the parentheses, he says the line before, so I just kind of, to make this quote short and sweet, I just inserted that, but those are his words. He says, "We refuse to resort to metaphysical and speculative doctrines in order to comprehend an organism, although it has in recent years been advanced not infrequently." The next few pages 317 through 319 in the edition I have, discusses physics a lot. It's very interesting, and it's just one of the parts that I cannot adequately get into in this video, but I think for those interested, it's an important section to read. Discusses physics, probability laws at the microscopic level, contrasted with kind of causality that we can see operating more on the macroscopic levels of a human being. So he talks about within an atom, we can talk only about things happening with probability, with quantum. But at a larger level, we can look at things a different way. So he kind of contrasts these two kind of perspectives. He talks a lot about Bohr and Jordan. So he says, let us assume that we are dealing essentially with macroscopic phenomena, so the larger scale of the thing. Would that mean that we are dealing with strict causality in our findings? He says, no, it's not strict causality, and there's nuance to what he says here, so, don't take this and run with it. But he says the results are always influenced by a causally intangible personal factor. So this is just kind of his idea that even when we're looking at humans, like as a whole, as an organism, it's not always, if they went through this experience, this is their environment, 2 + 2 = 4, it's not as simple. There's a personal factor, there's an individual personality here that we can't always have this strict causality where we can easily make predictions of what their performance is going to be. He's not there asserting that, I don't know, I don't think that contradicts I don't know what to say. I don't think he's asserting that there is this other thing within us, ourselves. I don't think he's saying we have to go beyond kind of any kind of materialism or physicalism, as far as he wants to resist the vitalist trend, for sure. But he does, a big part of this whole book is just the existence of what makes us individuals. What are the personal factors? What is the role of choice insofar as we have a capacity for decision making? These existential kind of factors that he wants to pay attention to. So it's an important quote. So yes, he wants to reject vitalism. Goldstein's thoughts here on the concept of, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, entelechy or entelechy. That was a concept that was raised by vitalists. He says, is it necessary to conceive this a causal process, what I was just talking about, the kind of process which cannot be said to be just like completely strictly causal, which we have just discussed, as the expression of peculiar forces, real but different from the usually assumed mechanical causal linkages, for example, of entelechy. Do we need this concept, this kind of extra thing, in order to explain the fact that among different people there's something that is not easily predictable about their performance? He says this last bullet point, is such a view necessary for understanding organic events? I believe not. Within the framework of scientific method, we can and must confine ourselves to such assumptions as are requisite for making the facts intelligible. So he says, I just don't see the necessity of introducing the concept of entelechy. Continues here. He also says that the other reason he critiques it is that it is, quote, entelechy is, quote, much too general and undefined. For example, Dreisk decrees that regarding entelechy, one must not imagine anything further than it is a regulating principle that cannot be characterized any more precisely. For me, this is really reminding me of Christian von Ehrenfels, who is a very important thinker in the line of development of Gestalt thought, and I've discussed that in one of my first videos that I made. He wanted to kind of assert that the Gestalt quality was this this ninth part or the seventh part, I forget what it was, but this extra part of a thing rather than just the system as a whole. It was like this organizing principle or this principle of order that is this other part of a thing, kind of like stackable parts. That's what's really reminding me of. And so Goldstein rejects that, just as Wertheimer rejected that kind of perspective of Ehrenfels. So there's a lot of similarity in the kind of topic of what they're paying attention to. What is it that is an organizing or regulating principle? They just have these kind of distinct ways of talking about it. And the third bullet point reads, what we call the essence of nature is not to be understood as having metaphysical existence, but only as a basis for cognition, a reason and knowledge. This is an important quote that, again, just kind of describes what I was saying. He's not asserting essence of a thing's nature, its essence, to be understood as a metaphysical part of it. It's not a part of its soul, as he's going to say later. This is really just like we're using this in order to describe things adequately, in order to talk about it in a way that helps us understand what we observe. So he's really like practical and pragmatic. He's not asserting essence, again, in a very like essentialist way that some use it. Okay. Continuing on the same topic, he says, this essence of nature cannot be dissected mechanistically into parts, but it is a structurally articulated organization. Again, this word organization and structure are important things to remember from this work. He says, true, we can dismember it so that we can construe parts, but this is only the case when we actually take it apart. That is, split it into its physico-chemical elements. Part elements versus real whole members. Again, I discussed that a few slides ago. He uses the word parts for kind of piecemeal, artificially separated parts of a whole versus whole members. Members is a word for when you're paying attention to a part in light of its whole. It's a little different than the vocabulary used by Max Wertheimer, so it's important to notice that they use those words differently. He says, it is our task to discriminate in this mass of phenomena, sorry for the typo, the true members from the artificial parts, and further to investigate the former as to their functional membership, their functional membership character in the organism and what significance they have for it. So I just wrote that down at the bottom there, the difference in their vocabularies. And so he just briefly talks about how he also rejects the teleological approach. He says, just as we had to reject vitalism and the idea of entelechy, so too do we reject the teleological approach. To be opposed to strictly causal reference, we do not need to imply leanings to teleology. So again, this comes back to, he says, I don't want to be strictly causal in how I talk about humans as if we can be easily kind of predictable. We're not easily predictable in certain ways. This does not mean that we need to opt for teleology. He says at most the concept of the so-called inner purposiveness in the sense of Kant could be taken into consideration. He continues on the same topic on this slide in more depth. He says, I agree with this thinker, I'm not sure how to say that, so far as to reduce the term teleological to this mere descriptive use. Again, Goldstein likes to use things in a mere descriptive way, not asserting their metaphysical existence, but is this descriptively helpful? He says, and furthermore, with his demand that the term purposive would be best avoided. Accordingly, we have not used it. Following the example of Karl Ernst von Baer, one could rather speak of an end. According to him, purpose is an intended task, whereas end is a given direction of activity, an intrinsically predetermined effect. The idea of an intended task is superfluous for an understanding of the organism, but that of a definite end, the actualization of its essence, may be very fruitful for our understanding of the organism. He says, yet the idea of end must also be taken only as a guiding notion for the procedure of knowledge rather than in a metaphysical sense, as it appears in von Baer. In this sense, one can describe the concept of wholeness as a category, as the category that substantiates and encompasses the subject matter of biology. So he says biology is concerned with the concept of wholeness. All right, so we're moving on to chapter 11. The topics of life and mind are going to be very big here, especially in the beginning of the chapter. And the problem of organismic hierarchy is kind of this idea of, can we separate organisms according to kind of more highly developed and complex organisms such as humans versus animals? What are the differences between them? This chapter is an extremely important one to understand the influence that Goldstein had on Merleau-Ponty on his book, The Structure of Behavior. These topics are very much what Merleau-Ponty is concerned with. He talks in a very, very similar way as Merleau-Ponty does. Okay. So he says, according to our basic stand, we do not concede the existence of anything apart from or additional to, but always regard the organism as a whole, in which segregation of any sort is artificial, and in which every phenomenon is a manifestation of the whole. This is his overarching approach, his organismic view of things. So in light of this, this is how his thought influences, okay, you bring up the topic of nature and mind. This idea of an antagonism between nature and mind is ages old, and one has tried in various ways to overcome this bifurcation. It is usually considered as an antagonism between consciousness, thinking, act on the one side, and life and immediate being on the other side. He's going to talk a lot, making critiques about Max Scheler, to whom mind also appears in opposition to life. And this chapter is also going to be talking about the topic of biological knowledge, which was the topic from chapter 7 we were just exploring. He says, certainly we have no reason to assume that for the animal there exists a world in the objectified sense. But this still does not make the animal a creature that is simply passively bound in a frame of certain drives, driven only by environmental stimuli. It appears this way only in isolating conditions. Excuse me. As we have seen, animal behavior cannot be understood as a summation of single processes. It points rather to an individual organization, on which basis alone it becomes intelligible as the expression of the tendency to actualize itself according to the circumstances. So too with humans. Quote, if one desires to understand human nature, one must try to understand these phenomena as the manifestations of one unitary being, as phenomena revealed through the isolating manner and changed in a specific way through that isolation. When we measure something, we're isolating it arbitrarily from its whole. So he's applying this holistic principle to the consideration of life and mind, or the vital sphere and mind. He says, quote, once a philosophy has divorced vital sphere and mind, they can never become reunited thereafter. No matter how such union may be defined, it never corresponds to the real and original entirety. Here the same is true in all instances in which a contrast between body and soul, between reflex and performance, between perception and action has been established. But the reverse is quite possible. Proceeding from that holistic entirety, one can understand the particulars as partitive regulations or limitations of the whole. He then spends time discussing Ernst Cassier's take on this topic of mind and life. He says he has important things to say, but he doesn't completely agree with all of it. He says that Cassier, part of what he says can be interpreted to support this quote. He says, the antagonism between mind and life corresponds to a struggle within that unitary entity that we describe as essential nature. So Goldstein says that this antagonism between mind and life needs to be situated within the whole, and that whole entity can be described as essential nature. To say no is fundamentally the expression of becoming conscious of the tension that arises in the coming to terms of the human organism with the world. The coming to terms, in turn, passes through catastrophic reactions and is experienced as conflict and resolution within man. So this all ties back to what we've talked about before in this series. A human experiences fear or even anxiety from a catastrophic situation. They are faced with a challenge, an obstacle to self-actualize, to meet their need in a particular situation. Their ability to have this attitude in which they can make an object out of their environment, to kind of rise above, to not just be strictly causal, to not be determined by their environment, but to have their own ability to experience resolution and to overcome. This is what distinguishes the human from the animal. So it's a very existential kind of perspective that Goldstein has here. And this, I think, is his ultimate thesis of the book, one of the ultimate conclusions that are really important to remember from this book. So to say no in order to kind of assert your own self in the face of a challenge. He says, likewise, the negation of the world by the mind represents only a transition toward ordered existence, the transition to self-actualize. It's not saying no for the sake of no, but it's really in order to, as he says, to regain a balance and to engage in the performance that you need to do. That's what he says there at the end of that quote. He continues, thus this tension makes an entirely different attitude possible, which manifests itself in the phenomenon of fear and of the freedom to cope with it. That is to say, to realize oneself in spite of danger and to shape the world. All shaping of the world, everything we call culture, becomes intelligible only from this concerted effort of mind and vital sphere, or better, of the unitary whole of human nature that is shaped in this particular mold. So life and mind come together in the unitary whole of human nature, Okay. This observed ability is what sets humans apart from animals. These are my words summarizing here. So this is an existential, conscious decision to cope in the face of fear, to overcome anxiety, to have an attitude toward the possible, to shape the world. Okay, so as a main quote here, in man, mind, consciousness, intellect, is as much part of this individual whole as the attitude, feelings, and so on, and the somatic, bodily processes. We call the whole the living being, because only in this way are we able to include the relation between consciousness, the feelings, and the somatic. So he wants to consider all of these things in light of one whole. He says the holistic approach with man as the starting point should furnish us with the basis for gaining an understanding of life phenomena. We do not intend to claim that the difference between man and animal is merely one of degree. The common factor rests first in the similarity of the total organization and the similarity as to holistic structure. So there is this similarity insofar as man and animal, they're all organisms, and organism is the main idea of this whole book. There are these similar principles of asserting oneself, of trying to meet one's needs, to self-actualize. But man is different in quality, not just in quantity, as to how man has that unique ability. As he said before, humans have this ability to overcome, to shape the world in a way that animals don't, in the difference of their level of consciousness and their will. But again, he's going to say here that does not mean that I'm asserting something that exists in a metaphysical sense as a part in the human soul. It's not in the animal soul like these philosophers have asserted. So he says this in this last bullet point. The human being cannot be regarded as a creature in which something was only added to the animal. Johann Gottfried von Herder already has recognized this clearly. He says, one has taken the human intellect as a separate force in the soul, which man obtained as a special addition in preference to all animals. This is, of course, philosophical nonsense, no matter how great the philosophers may be who say so. All individualized powers of man and animal are nothing but metaphysical abstractions. Okay, so we're at the end of our thoughts on this chapter and on the book. So this very last section, it's truly very brief. It's just 2 short pages, but he touches on the principle of evolution, the question of evolution, which, again, this work was originally published in 1934, and I'm still learning about kind of the history of where science and biology at the time was in accepting the work of evolution theory. And apparently it had not yet been kind of integrated with an understanding of genetics. That all really came later. So it was still this question mark at the time. But what's most important here is to realize that his interest in this section is not just, is evolution true, but is it helpful as a guiding principle? And remember that his topic here is biological knowledge. And his approach has been this from whole to parts view. Bird's eye view of the whole helps us understand the parts. So does evolution as a guiding principle help our understanding of biological knowledge? And he's not really saying it does. He's saying, I don't find this helpful. I don't find this in line with my line of thought. So he's not really a fan of it in these couple pages. But again, he's not going into this long exploration of it, if it's true or false, but really just, I'll read the quotes, but I'll read what he says about it. Okay, and so he says at one point in these 2 pages at the end, he says, we must content ourselves with these few words regarding the problem of evolution, which is certainly obscured by a mass of prejudices. So he acknowledges that they're not in a place of this clear understanding of it all, and that prejudice gets in the way of how one looks at this question of evolution. So he says this kind of principle of evolution, this question of evolution, is usually seen as a development from lower to higher creatures. He says an actual genetic emergence of the latter from the former is assumed. All the objections that we have just considered stand in the way of such an attempt. In principle, it remains implausible how the more perfect should arise from the less perfect. The opposite would be rather more intelligible. The fundamental thought we adopted as an orienting principle, again, the key is looking at these things as principles, as guiding ideas, is that the less perfect only becomes intelligible as a variation and aberration of the perfect, but not the opposite. Goldstein has been fundamentally kind of against this idea that things can just be stackable, that we can just stack parts from the more simple to the more complex. He says this kind of principle flies in the face of my guiding principle of the whole being more than the sum of its parts. He says, besides, I cannot see in what way our knowledge can be advanced if we trace one phenomenon to another, if we assume an evolution of phenomena. He says, in other words, each single phenomenon, individual, species, etc., refers us back to the next higher whole. Only with a known reference to the superordinated whole would it be possible to properly evaluate how that being to which the observed phenomenon belongs exists in reality. So, I think I disagree with Goldstein's critique of evolution, because he doesn't really spend much time saying that even if it's a guiding principle that might not always apply in every way, that my holistic principle oftentimes differs and is also valuable in understanding the whole of a thing. Not all of reality is atomistic. That doesn't mean that evolution is not true at all. I wish he had been a bit more nuanced in saying that, but I do think that's what he is really paying attention to, is not the fact of evolution being true or false historically, but just the principle of evolution is what he's really paying attention to. Is that a guiding principle? Is atomism a principle that makes sense to us in being able to have a biological knowledge? No, it's not helpful. So those are his words on the topic, and I think it's important to realize that. And I'm going to also, in my description of this video, mention a really great article that talks about evolution and how it touches on the work of Merleau-Ponty, who is also concerned with these questions very much so. We're going to talk a lot about that in our next videos, starting with the structure of behavior. But there's an academic who wrote a really great article on this topic more, and it does mention Goldstein briefly, but mostly about Merleau-Ponty and this question of evolution and his thoughts on it. So thanks so much for tuning into this series on the organism. I hope it helps connect folks to this really important work, really important thinker. Just my impression of Goldstein is that he really encapsulates just being this bridge between Gestalt and existential thought and person-centered thought. He really is this person in whom all those paths really crossed, and he had this huge impact in humanistic thought, holistic thought, not just in biology, but in psychology especially, and also in philosophy, and his impact on Merleau-Ponty, who we're going to get into. Thank you. Bye.